Okay, dear colleagues, welcome to this last leg of this conference. I'm Sadi Lalou, director of the Paris Institute for Advanced Study, and I'm extremely happy to host the last part of this amazing conference, organized by our colleagues, Jim, Flor, and Helen. Jim is currently a fellow here. I'm extremely happy to host this last session, and I'm also a bit sad that it is so timely. As we all know, the Institute is always welcoming very important research and often timely research, and often this timeliness is not so happy as it is now. But after this final conference, which Jim will introduce in a minute, you will have the opportunity to refresh in the yard, and I hope this will at least create a moment of happiness. Thank you again for being here, and enjoy. And Jim, without further ado.
Well, I think most people who are here, there may be a few extra colleagues who've arrived. I see some of our fellows in the Institute, and I'll just echo what Sadi said. Welcome to this beautiful house, which was built sometime early in the reign of Louis XIV. Maybe we can talk about that over drinks tonight. But since we don't have a whole lot of time, and we've had already a long 2 days of meetings with lots of very interesting discussion, we're going to now move to sort of a final roundtable. And it is a great pleasure to welcome most of you who were with us earlier. There were a couple who didn't make it quite to all of the conference, but they're all extremely familiar with the topic. And Hélène, you want me to introduce the panel? Okay, I'll do my best here. So we have four distinguished panelists. Mirna Safi, who is on the end here, who is a French sociologist, I think teaching at Sciences Po, right? And has written extensively on these issues, especially the citizenship angle. Although she said she was going to talk about something slightly different than her famous book. My great friend and colleague, François Héran, whom I have known for over 40 years, unbelievably, who is a professor at the Collège de France and has built the Institut Convergences Migrations, which last count has 630 scholars in France. So it's got to be one of the largest migration institutes on the planet. He has really put the migration studies on the map, I would say, in France. And I'm sure many of you know the writings of François Héran. The person who deserves extra special thanks, and she gets an extra glass of wine tonight, is Brenda Yeoh, who came all the way from Singapore for this. But I think she likes to come to Paris. That's my sense. And Brenda and I have known each other also for decades and met in Japan and in East Asia in various meetings. So we're glad that Brenda made the trip. She did say this is the first time she's had a chance to get out and do something in person. So it's extraordinary that we were able to put this whole thing together and have it in person in spite of the pandemic and now a major conflict in Europe. And I'm sure we may hear a little bit more about Ukraine later on. And finally, we have I don't know how many children you got, but Jason, who has some family obligations, he may have to leave a little early, but Jason Gagnon, whom I also met somewhere along the line several years ago, who is working in the Center for Development at OECD here in Paris. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about the economics. So we'll hear things about economics, about politics, about demography, about the sociology in these questions of migration and development. Hélène, do you want to say a couple of words before we get started? No? Hélène's just going to sit there. Well, let me just say also, before I stop, I could not do this. I couldn't have done this without my two co-conspirators here, partners in crime, Flo Goubert from the IRD, also the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme, and Hélène Thiollet, whom I've known since she was a student. So, you know, these are two of the best partners I could have had in putting all this thing together. And between the three of us, I think we brought a group of people here together who, many of whom did not know each other before this. So we've created a sort of a new dynamic, I think, in migration studies by bringing this particular group together. So hopefully this will be the first of many future collaborations and a lot of spin-offs from this. I also want to thank my colleagues from the Tower Center and from IEA who are here. I don't know where Bora's back there, Jenny's back there, all of the colleagues and the ones at IEA who made this work, Lisette, who is about to film everything back there. So I want to thank all of them, and when we finish, we'll give them a round of applause. I do want to recognize two other groups here. Actually, we have a group of students with us. I want all of you to take a moment to meet our students. These are the top students at SMU who are in our Tower Scholars program, which is a program in public policy and international affairs. And they have been very active in the conference. They're all writing journals and going to write a report when they get back. So not a bad deal to get to come to Paris and spend your spring break here hanging out with a group of scholars. So we're really, really pleased to have them here. And then finally, my colleague and dean, Professor Tom DiPiero, who is sitting back here quietly on the back row. You may hear a little bit more from him when we get to the reception part of this. So I will stop there, turn the panel over. I don't know if we have a specific order for this, so why don't we just start with Mirna, François, Brenda, and then, no, Jason has to leave early, so we'll have to start in the other direction. We'll go Jason, Brenda, François, and Mirna. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. This is the second time I take the floor in the last 2 days. Yesterday I discussed, so sorry if I'm repetitive with my introduction, but I'm Jason Gagnon. I head a unit at the OECD Development Center called Migration Skills Unit. I'm a couple years removed from having any pure academic entourage or work activities. So this is just a disclaimer that my view here is really from a public policy view, and weaving in the OECD's ideas and work into what we know about migration and development. And I specifically tried to make reference to inequality into that work as much as possible. And I just wanted to thank also the organizers for inviting me. And also, I should mention that I didn't mention this yesterday, but I'm also a fellow at the ECM, which is also one of the co-organizers. So, so thanks for that. So without further ado, it's true that we're gathered here in a time where migration is unfortunately being discussed, perhaps negatively, and this has been an ongoing theme, and it's the narrative on migration has been particularly not always a good one. Refugees go home, refugees welcome, those kinds of discussions have been and have been very much prominent in media, in social network discussions. But it's also, I think, very important to say how far we've come along with actually bringing a positive tone for that, both on the scholastic side and the academic side, but also on the policy side. And, you know, I just want to mention here that, you know, the 2030 agenda has, for the first time, brought migration, international migration, into the fold, into the global agenda. And we took that notch up a little bit when we signed the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. The fact that there are two is another discussion, I think, that's worthy of mention. But those things are lofty reasons to be optimistic as well. So my point of view here is going to come particularly, the OECD Development Center works particularly with non-OECD member countries, although we have OECD member countries part of our group of governance. But we particularly look at it from not only the sending country point of view, but also the hosting country point of view from a developing country perspective. That is South-South migration for some of them that refer to it as that. And so from the origin country, we may look at, you know, immigration as a safety valve, as a remittances, as a source of, you know, financial or finance for development source, diasporas as enablers for social development, brain circulation, you know, strengthening human capital and innovation, And then on the hosting country side, we look at whether immigration helps reduce skills mismatches, whether immigrants expand the domestic market, immigrants contribute to financing social protection systems, or lead to increased innovation and entrepreneurship. So through all these types of angles, I've reflected about our work and whether they contribute or reduce inequalities. And what I grouped, or what I came up with, is a group of 3 categories. One was inequality and integration or inclusion. A second one was inequality in the access itself to migration, and that's where I'm going to put the most focus on today. And then inequality and remittances, and I'll follow up with that with a quick response, or quick insights on what we feel is the policy response that's the most adequate, or at least where we think there are gaps. And I was asked that question yesterday at lunchtime with some of you, where we at the OECD see the gaps, where academia could probably push further. And I'll finish on data concerns, and I know that was brought up yesterday, that we always finish up on data concerns, but I find that that's particularly an important thing to dig deep, and we spoke about diasporas today. I'll speak a little bit about how we calculate emigration. On inequality and integration and inclusion, I'm going to go pretty quickly on this because I really want to focus more on the access to migration, but I think it's particularly telling what we're seeing today in terms of the focus on integration and inclusion. A lot of academic papers and a lot of even policy in the OECD and even beyond the OECD, the World Bank and the UNDP and the United Nations in general focus a lot of their policy focus and their policy dialogues on integration in high-income countries, whereas most of the action right now on migration is happening between developing countries, and that might be decreasing, but it's still more than half that population. And it's particularly happening in a specific context. It's happening in context of forced displacement, and it's happening beyond camps, beyond refugee camps, and beyond what UNHCR would call refugees. It's happening in cities, it's happening in secondary cities, it's happening in rural areas, and there's very little focus, policy focus, either from the global agenda, from the regional agenda, but even from the national side of things, where countries simply don't have inclusion or integration aspects on their radar in any way or shape or form, and it's increasing in some specific corridors, and that's because of the attractivity. It's due to 2 things. It's due to the attractivity of certain countries that are growing much faster than their neighbor countries, but it's also due to, and I'll come back to this in the access to migration, it's due to what we all call the migration hump, and the access to migration that's becoming more and more accessible and more reachable for people, not only people, but specific countries that are starting to transition from low income to more middle income countries. And so a few years ago, and then this is my transition to maybe one last point on that. We're working right now on social protection access and forced displacement context, and that's a very specific example of how this really comes to light. I mentioned this a while ago. 88% or so of forced displacement happens between developing countries. The pandemic has made this a real priority, helping people not only in the humanitarian and in the short-term concerns that they have, but also in the long-term concerns they have. Yet social protection policies for people that aren't necessarily born or citizens or nationals of the country is simply not on the radar. And so you have a certain population that is remaining in the long term or in the medium term simply needing humanitarian access because they don't have the means to be self-reliant. And so there's really a need to shift that focus a little bit more towards beyond humanitarian thinking and more towards long-term, medium-term self-reliance, community resilience thinking, and it's simply not happening. So my transition to access to migration, this is where I'm going to focus most of this talk, and I'm aware I'm taking more time than I expected. But we asked ourselves a few years ago whether this the global shift in wealth, and when I say that, I know many of you are probably thinking of China, but it's really due to a lot of different emerging countries, the shift in wealth in the world and the shifting economic center of gravity in the world was impacting migration in any way. What we found was that you might expect, given the wealth was shifting towards emerging economies or middle income countries, that migration was also shifting there. But what we actually found, and if you look at the global stocks of data, is that low and middle income source countries were actually increasingly in the wake of shifting wealth and in the wake of them becoming richer, shifting their migration towards higher income countries. And low and middle income country to low and middle income country migration was actually decreasing. It was actually only 1/5 of all migration. So the south-south migration idea is not necessarily about south and south. It's really an income idea, and we should really start shifting the way we speak about that and think about not only is it a southern and southern country, but really is it what are the actual job opportunities in that country? And so we started thinking about the migration hump. And I'm going to try to be quick here. Most of you know of this migration hump, but it's the idea that with economic wealth and with economic GDP per capita growth, you first increase your immigration up to a certain point at which there are enough job opportunities to absorb people in the country that people reduce their immigration rates, and eventually migration starts decreasing, and that's from a transversal transversal data point of view. That seems to be the case. And so there's a lot of debate, and we started asking ourselves, what if there was more ODA, more aid? What if there was more FDI? What if there's more trade? Would that push that curve up? And if you start thinking about that, you start thinking about whether the curve might change itself. And so there's an entire public policy response that corresponds to that might be very interesting for countries to start thinking about more. And they go beyond migration policies. Those curves could change for a number of reasons. They might change for reasons of country characteristics. They might change because of language issues or border issues, colonial ties. They might be driven by institutions. They might be driven by social networks. They might be driven by migration policies, and they certainly are. And that's what we mostly focus on when we think of policies. But they're also driven by a much broader set of policies, and those policies are much more prominent in society, and yet we don't really ever focus on what their impact is on the access to migration. Those have to do with agricultural policies, subsidies, labor market policies, education policies, social protection policies. And so we looked at that for a number of countries, and we found, I'm not going to go into the details here, but we found that a number of different public policies gave people more access to migration. Time's up? Oh, no. 1 minute. Okay, well, I'll wrap up with just a point on inequality and remittances. But one point that was important in that debate was that there's a big rollout of social protection. I mentioned this earlier with forced displacement. Social protection has an impact on lifting financial constraints for migration. And so the second that you start rolling out big social protection programs and you're creating some sort of no access into the country, while you're actually also creating access and no access to migration under certain circumstances. And so we did a big literature review that's not out yet, but we're hoping to get it out, and it's very interesting in terms of the public policy response. Very quick word on remittances. I'll skip most of what I was going to say, but I just wanted to say two things. One is the pandemic made it very clear, is making it increasingly clear that there's an inequality within the migrant community between those that actually access remittance providers and remittance receivers. And the fact that the pandemic has pushed the modes of remitting, especially when we were confined and you couldn't even get out of your house, the modes of transferring to online transfers. Well, anybody who didn't have access to a computer wasn't necessarily computer literate, simply didn't have access to those types of remittances. And so you're creating a bigger wedge between those that have and those that have not. The other point was, and then I'll finish on this. So I won't talk about the policy response, unfortunately, or the data, sorry. Last point, just on Ukraine. It has to do with Ukraine, but it has to do with a more global picture. There's a big shifting of the type of migrant that is in need or in demand. And that's being driven by a lot of countries' plans and strategies to move towards more capital-intensive economies. You see it in the Gulf countries, and that's a very interesting case because it's the countries that are the most dependent on migrant labor. And if they start shifting the type of migrant that comes and works into their countries, well, they may be also shifting the dependencies, or the dependencies is probably the wrong word, but the connection that those migrants have with their home countries. And so you're actually impacting a whole wealth of countries that are very, I would say, dependent on remittances from these countries. I'll take the example of Nepal, which is a very interesting case in this specific context, because a lot of Nepalese who work in the Gulf remit, and they remit up to 30% of Nepal's GDP. If you cut that group in half, you're cutting a very substantial part of Nepal's GDP, and suddenly you have a very complicated task for Nepal to deal with. And so in the Ukraine case, this is actually happening not in the way that we're actually speaking about mostly in the media. It's happening because Russia's economy is falling drastically, and Russia was the source of many countries' remittances to Central Asian countries. Tajikistan was even more dependent than Nepal on remittances, up to 35%. Those remittances are being cut off pretty dramatically and pretty quickly, and my feeling is that a lot of the story on development in the medium term will actually be in Central Asia in that sense. Thank you very much. I'm not going to take any more time, but thanks.
Thank you, and I'm glad I follow after Jason, because I certainly can't, in a sense, do the kind of economic analysis of remittances that I think is done so very well. So there's so many ways of approaching migration and inequality. I was in a bit of a loss as to what to speak about, and again, it's good that Jason's spoken on in a sense, the role of the state and migration policies, on transnational social protection policies, and how that can contribute to either ameliorating or widening the inequalities in not just in the country receiving remittances, but as he mentions, the knock-on effects on other countries. I think in the workshop, we also heard about another approach looking at inequalities, which is to do with migrants' experience of inequalities and how this is built on constructions of skills, as well as how this is cross-cut by notions of gender and ethnicity. So these dimensions do come in alongside class as very important factors that shape the landscape of inequalities. So the pandemic, I think, has major effects, and in accentuating inequalities. The closure of borders have emphasized economic nationalism for many countries. They pulled back, and this has accentuated in a sense, the depiction of temporary migrants as transient non-citizens, and that has exposed them to xenophobia and discrimination. So these are some of the things that came out at the workshop, but I was going to, in a sense, speak on something else, and which I've been working on, which I did present a little bit of at the workshop earlier on, and which is to turn attention away from the state and the migrant experience, but to look at the meso level, to look at the role of the migration industry. So this is one of the more recent conceptual contributions in the research on migration in the Asian context, and this is based on the idea that migration is a heavily mediated process that involves the orchestration among a diverse set of actors with very different motivations. So the term migration industry, I think, is familiar to most, but usually connotes pejorative meanings because it alerts us to the role that brokers play in in a sense, increasing recruitment costs and so forth. But I think we need to get beyond that and to look at the significant roles that played by a wide range of intermediaries. This could be brokers, recruiters, smugglers, travel agents, transport providers, humanitarian organizations, immigration lawyers, housing and placement agents, how they contribute to the organization, facilitating and the channeling of migration flows. So for migration scholars like myself and others who are working on low-skilled migration in the Asian context, we note that migration is often temporary, it's often circular, feminized, and contractual. And these have been a major trend in terms of the rapid growth of a whole ecosystem of intermediaries that fills what's been called the middle space of migration. And this has, in a sense, urged many of us to try to open the black box of migration, to try to illuminate the kinds of broader infrastructure and that makes mobility possible. So I just wanted to make a couple of points about shifting attention to the migration industry and adopting migration brokers as a possible methodological vantage point and why this might be productive in thinking about inequalities in two ways. So firstly, bringing the migration industry into the fold of more or less state-centric migration governance analysis allows us to look at the interdependent dynamics between the state and the migration industry in controlling migration. Because the argument here is that the state orders migration through the migration industry's pursuit of profit. And they do this not just in the pursuit of profit, but they also, in the course of pursuing profit, produce migrants as governable legal subjects that, in a sense, then become more easily exploitable, more easy to, in a sense, extract sort of labor power or profit from these subjects. So also, by outsourcing certain elements of migration governance to the migration industry, whilst at the same time retaining regulatory control, the state is able to, in a sense, save cost, to ensure flexibility in the system, to avoid vilification, and to circumvent, I think very importantly, circumvent the need for formal cooperation with migrant-sending countries. So this adds to the global inequalities between destination and origin, because the middle space is, in a sense, functions according to the logics of commercial profit. A second point that I want to make is that it's by focusing on those who move migrants rather than the migrants themselves that this, in a sense, paves the way for a broader conceptualization of the infrastructure that contributes to making mobility possible. So no, migrants don't just move because they aspire to move. They don't just move, or they're not just constrained from moving because the state says they can or cannot move. There's also the role of the migration industry that does quite a bit of the work in moving these people, and that is certainly something that we need to take into consideration in thinking about global inequalities. So in their seminal article, I mentioned this before, Xiang Piao and Johan Lindqvist, on this article called Migration Infrastructures. They talk about the 5 dimensions of migration infrastructure. Firstly, to consider the commercial, and here we focus on recruitment intermediaries as an example of the commercial logics that is part of the migration impulse. Secondly, definitely you need to look at the role of the state, the regulatory functions, and the state apparatus and the procedures and documentation, licensing, training, and so forth. These are processes that I think needs to be taken into account. Thirdly, the technological, and I think Jason mentioned digital communication, digital ways of transferring remittances, communications, and so forth. That dimension has become even more important with the onset of the pandemic. And fourthly, the humanitarian NGOs and international organizations are also part of the whole migration infrastructure. And finally, the social, which refers to migrants' own networks. So it's to understand the drivers and the outcomes of migration and the production of socioeconomic inequalities require us to, in a sense, go beyond focusing just on the migrant experience, but to attend to these multiple dimensions of the infrastructuring process. So these are 5 processes. I mean, I'm sure we can think of different ways of cutting the cake, but I found Xiang and Lindquist's ideas about migration infrastructure and the multiple dimensions important to look at. And in Asia, this kind of growing emphasis on migration infrastructures has spawned a whole range of new research, from looking at emigration management to labor recruitment and placement agencies, which is what I work on, to even areas like international marriage brokerage. Because in Asia, marriage migration, which is something that we didn't touch on, is actually a very important aspect of the movement of people, international movement of people in Asia. I think we had papers on student mobilities, and there the educational infrastructure shaping student mobilities would be, again, another very important aspect. And I've got a student working on how, in that sense, educational infrastructure is moving to the digital platform and the consequences of that. I mean, because, yeah, of digital brokerage as opposed to face-to-face. So to conclude, this infrastructural turn, if I may, in migration studies is both, in my mind, vital and innovative in foregrounding the socio-material arrangements that mediate human mobilities. It explains how profits are extracted from laborers for employers and industry. It explains how, in that sense, governable subjects are produced out of migrants so as to facilitate states management, and it also contributes to our understanding of the uneven, precarious, yet aspirational pathways for migrants themselves. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Jim, for this invitation. The idea I have is to consider, well, inequalities between countries and not social inequalities within countries. Well, so it's a special focus, but I shall consider essentially the question of asylum seekers. We are now entering into a third wave of asylum crisis after Syria, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine. And as you know, maybe we are just now in France in the period of a presidential campaign. And what is striking, if you look at the way the debate is developing in our country, it's really a Franco-French debate. Well, some leaders of the far right have made a pilgrimage in Budapest, in Hungary, with the idea of converting France into a new Hungary or something like that. It's absurd because we have very, very different histories and relationships with migration. I shall elaborate a little more on that later. But in general, the debate is really limited to France, and when we try to make, we don't make comparisons. We are in the public debate. Most of the political leaders are convinced that France is the most important immigration country in Europe, that we are more or less threatened by a migration tsunami. For example, the formula which is constantly used by Marine Le Pen is la folie migratoire, the migration craziness, something like that, la folie migratoire. So the idea that there is nothing rational in our migration policy, that we are absolutely overwhelmed by waves of migrants and so on and so on. And there is one of the tricks they use to spread this idea is to the manipulation of absolute numbers. And I'm struck by the contrast, the huge contrast between the statistical initiation we have now thanks to the COVID crisis, the COVID epidemics, and the statistical illiteracy we maintain in the field of migration. We know now that, for example, the expansion of the epidemics must be measured by, for example, the incidence rate. Incidence rate is a number of new cases in a determined period for per 100,000 population or 10,000 population, and this has been initiated by the Financial Times, and then it came through other newspapers across Europe, and now every day, for example, in Le Monde, 5 journalists are updating every day the statistics of the COVID pandemics using incidence rates and explaining that this, for public health reason, it's absolutely indispensable. It's the only way to make serious comparisons between periods, between départements, between countries, and so on and so on. So we've had a fantastic initiation to relative numbers, to the use of statistics, of relative statistics, of rates, etc., in the public health domain. A huge contrast with the immigration field, where there is absolutely none of that, never. And so, just let's take an example. In a recent debate, Eric Zemmour, the new this polemist, who succeeded in Eric Zemmour. Who succeeded in more or less he has 15% or 16% of the voting intentions now. But he explained the other day that we received 1 million Syrians in our country. And in fact, the true number is about 35,000. So there is a huge gap between the perception of what we really did and what and the importance given in the public debate in this number. Well, it's of course an exaggeration. But many candidates also, many candidates of the public have also completely false ideas of the order of magnitude of the immigration phenomenon in France, and it's so. Personally, I had the opportunity to present the figures, the relative figures, to many MPs or congressmen, congresswomen, maybe 70 of them, etc., and trying to insist on the importance of manipulating relative numbers. I think it permeates more or less some minorities within the parties. But the problem, the substantial problem behind this question of the statistical tools is that in many European countries, but especially in France, it has been measured by some polls, we overestimate our attractivity. And we think that we have a lot of measures, for example, special allowance to the asylum seekers, medical help for undocumented illegal migrants, the law of a citizenship law based on the right of le droit du sol, ius soli, etc. And in fact, of course, if we try to make serious comparisons, this is not at all the case. And I was struck by the fact that in last November, when the OECD published its last annual report on migration across OECD countries, the same day a poll announced that 1/3 of the public opinion was attracted by hesitating between Marine Le Pen and Éric Zemmour, between two versions of the extreme right, which had a narrative, who have a narrative on migration which is completely far away what OECD explained. So one of the points in debate is our welcoming or receiving capacities. And there is the idea, and several programs of, include the idea that we should welcome exactly the number of migrants, of economic migrants, who are required by our welcoming capacity or by the needs of our economy. And we should tailor the number of economic migrants according to our capacities. And in fact, what is exactly the meaning we could give to the idea of welcoming or receiving capacities? In fact, it's not a scientific concept, it's purely a political concept. You can, for example, have the idea that, okay, the size of a population of a country is a structural capacity. The bigger a country is, the able he is to welcome foreigners, for example. So you can include into the structural receiving capacities the size of the population, demographic dimension, the income, the GDP or the GDP per inhabitant, and so on. And if you you consider the number of immigrants, asylum seekers, or positive decisions taken vis-à-vis asylum seekers, etc., or if you consider also all the other categories of migrants relate proportionally to the population, per million population, for example, the rank of France in Europe comes down from the second rank or the third rank to the 15th, for example. And so the attractivity of France is absolutely not at all what we think it is in the public debate. And the rest of the capacities, of the receiving capacities we have, are in fact determined by, well, a political mobilization, exactly like the number of respirateurs you can use to combat the COVID epidemics. This is depending from your mobilization capacity. And okay, so this is a part of our welcoming capacity. The other one is, yes, the other one is the organization. Well, for example, the administrative organization. It is absolutely clear that the federal organization of Germany was a very positive asset to welcome people. That also the Concordate, the pact between the state and the religious authorities in Germany, was extremely helpful to welcome migrants, because in these countries, charities, NGO organizations benefit from the religious tax, which of course does not exist in our laïc republic, so that these charities, for example, have hospitals, they have houses for the elderly, they have equipments, etc. You don't find the equivalent of this in our country, because we are convinced that this is up to the state. And we have the idea of a vertical link between the state and the citizen, and not at all the idea that the welcoming capacities should be, based on horizontal relationships with the rest of the society. So I think I have just mentioned some factors of inequalities between countries. I don't have any solution to reverse the history. Of course, there is another source of diversity or inequality, is the relationship we have with the ex-colonial empire. The Eastern country were themselves the colony of the Soviet Union. And so, of course, and the last point is the fact that alors les rentes de situation, position rent, I don't know if you have this term, the fact that, for example, some countries are in the first line, as island states, or Greece, or Cyprus, or Malta, or by far the countries in Europe which, proportionally to the population, have to welcome the highest number of asylum seekers and give positive decisions vis-à-vis asylum seekers. And this is due, of course, to the Dublin regulation, which consists in deepening the gap between countries instead of homogenizing, instead of establishing inequalities between countries. So this is more or less, in a descriptive way, the picture I can trace of the European situation, which is very, of course, problematic.
Okay. First, thanks a lot, Hélène and Jim, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm quite embarrassed because I couldn't make it to attend these 2 days, and I'm also embarrassed because during this roundtable, maybe my speech is going to be a little bit different. I'll speak from the perspective of a sociologist with a kind of a scholarly approach, a bit distant from the, let's say, more policy-oriented approach that we've just heard, and tackling very pressing issues. But I believe actually these questions, the relation between migration and inequality, can have very relevant policy implications. So I've been trained and I'm still working surrounded by social stratification scholars. So people who work actually on social mobility, the role of education, social class, socioeconomic attainment, etc. And I've been working on migration for 20 years now. And it's striking if you open a textbook on social stratification and social mobility, which are really the central fields, classic field in sociology. It's striking that it's very rare to find like a chapter that tackles specifically migration. You'll find sporadically migration tackled, mainly in the ethnic and racial chapter, if it's a US textbook. And in Europe, what we actually see more and more is that migration tends to be connected, let's say, to the equal opportunity approach to social inequality, with the discrimination literature focusing on immigrant background as one discriminatory characteristic. And it's not very clear, actually, in this literature to what extent it's migration by itself or other characteristics that are related to migration. And so I tried a bit to clarify the connection of migration to social inequality in a book that is entitled Migration and Inequality. And I actually, the book is a synthesis of a lot of different research that connect to this topic. In migration studies, you'll find three important questions: theories of migration, assimilation, which is really a very dominant framework, what migrants become, and then the consequences of migration. And in these three questions, you will again find some kind of inequality perspective, but not completely unified in a clear framing. And in this book, I try to argue that actually migration is a very interesting case study for social stratification research and social inequality. And I try to argue that it's an interesting case study because it helps us actually discuss all the different dimensions of social inequality, the different resources, multidimensional resources of social inequality. But also it's a very interdisciplinary actually case study where you have to actually use a lot of different disciplinary perspectives such as economics, sociology, social psychology, population studies, etc. Legal studies, and also I argue that it relates to both what we call in the literature cultural and structural mechanisms of social inequality, and also multi-level processes, the micro, the meso, the macro level, etc. And then I try to, for instance, discuss the definition of immigration by itself, and the fact that it's actually today a category of inequality that is very important in migration societies because it's an ascriptive characteristics. It's related to birthplace as defined, and so birthplace is something you cannot change, and also it's durable in the sense that it's been shown to affect socioeconomic outcomes for a long time, and it's transmittable to some extent since we also discuss the attainments of second generation, and now in France with Yeoh, we will work on the third generation of migrants. So as an ascriptive, durable and transmittable characteristic, this has a lot of implications in terms of a relation to social inequality and distribution of resources. In the book, I try to sketch a simplified model of social inequality, asking 3 questions: the resources, what resources, the categories, whom, and the question of the mechanisms of inequality. And I show that migration actually relates to social inequality by affecting 3 different channels. The first one is the economic channel, and here the resources, labor and social positions as social stratification, scholars like to call them. And I discuss here actually classic cases of guest workers, of care workers today in today's economy. In the second channel is the legal channel, and here I discuss actually rights as being the main resource, and then I discuss actually the literature that shows how rights can affect actually other socioeconomic outcomes, and I elaborate a lot on the examples of undocumented migrants and refugees more recently. And thirdly, I discuss the implication on the ethno-racial channel, and here actually the main resource is respect, or what sociologists like to call also moral worth. And here I discuss also the literature, mainly based on the US, on how migration affects ethno-racial classifications in societies. And so in this book, I highlight mainly the fact that migration affects 3 types of categorizations that are central to social inequality dynamics in today's societies. Types of workers, types of citizens, and types of humans with these 3 channels. Now, if I have a few more minutes, maybe I can tell you a bit of some of the empirical studies that I'm conducting right now on each of these channels, and maybe since Jim maybe said that I work on citizenship, I'll focus on the legal channel. I have some ongoing work on each of these channels, but maybe on the legal channel in particular. So again, we have a lot of studies that show that legal status affects attainments, migrants' attainments in societies. But it's not very clear whether legal status at entries, I mean, there's a lot of studies on undocumented migrants, mainly in the US, but also more and more in other countries, that show clearly negative outcomes, including actually non-economic ones such as health, etc. But it's not very clear to what extent legal status at entry has lasting effects on immigrants' outcomes in societies. And actually we have some methodological issues here because migrants are selected into legal status at entry. And so recently we've used a Yeoh survey. Maybe you're familiar with the Trajectoire and Origin, this very rich French data set, where we have a lot of information on pre-migratory trajectories that we can actually account for. And we have information on the first legal status, human entry in France. And what we find is that so gross correlation, so what you see initially is that a status such as students or spouse status are actually positively correlated with economic outcomes such as income or other neighborhood outcomes that we actually have in the data, such as the neighborhood average income or the neighborhood proportion of immigrants. Refugees, on the contrary, are actually negatively correlated with these outcomes. But once you account for pre-selection into these categories, and we have several methodologies to do so, actually we find that it's only the refugee status that seems to affect durably, and other effects are mainly related to selection, basically. The refugee status is also partly related to selection. So when you control for pre-migratory trajectories, actually the effect is lower, but it's still significant, mainly on income, for instance, and also interestingly on the proportion of migrants in the neighborhood. I won't elaborate too much on this example. Just let me move to another one. And here I won't have a lot of findings because it's ongoing work, but another idea that is related to the legal channel is, of course, naturalization. And I've done some work with some other colleagues on the effect of naturalization on immigrants' outcomes, in mainly the labor market outcomes. And there are today several studies that converge on showing that naturalization has positive effects, even correcting for selection into naturalization. Now, what's interesting is that this particular effect of the legal the legal status seems to be transmittable. So the question is whether we have some kind of effect of naturalization on second generations socioeconomic outcomes. And now some data sets can allow us actually to delve further into this question, to what extent actually parental naturalization can have lasting effects on second generation. So people who are born in the country, in countries such as France, actually these people are French, overwhelmingly French human majority, but still they can have different social mobility pathways that are related somehow to their parental naturalization, and more specifically to the timing of their parental naturalization. I've been working on these questions also more recently. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Jim, for being so careful to assess equality across disciplines and caring for the status of economics in this panel. So other economists could have taken this role, obviously, and would have presented different perspective, but maybe very quickly, I want to say one word on global inequality. I think we should distinguish global inequality and local inequality. You could ask the connection between migration and global inequality, but also locally, whether migration increases inequality within communities or not. So we'll speak mostly on global inequality. I want to say something I like to, when I'm teaching, undergrads, I start by saying, if you would want to study inequality at the global level and pick randomly with an helicopter people around the earth and ask them what is their income and take a whole range of information on them, you would find eventually that their gender, their education, their age, their experience, their IQ, anything characterizing them explains 20 to 30% of inequality between people, and the single one factor explaining 75% of global inequality is where you are born. So it means also that when you do development, there is and you improve inequality within countries, this has a relatively weak effect on global inequality, while when you move people from poor to rich countries, this has a very strong direct effect on reducing global inequality. So there is no good real substitute to more migration to reduce global inequality. And I think it's that now from this you ask yourself, so is inequality injustice? And it's not the same. Inequality is not necessarily injustice, but I think we would all agree that where you are born is not your choice, and you didn't do anything wrong by being born in country A or country B. And so if you try to apply for the most standard and well-known concept of justice, which is the veil of ignorance, and you would ask people, would you be for more open borders? Without knowing, under veil of ignorance, in which country you would be born, obviously everybody would be for a much open world than the current situation. Now there are different, and from there you if you admit this, you ask yourself, so what can we do? What are the ways to do it? And different social sciences are thinking about this, including economics. Yeah, so I will leave this open for the sake of time, but I'm happy to talk more privately about this. Two very quick things about local inequality. This is more a comment on what Jason said. Initially, usually migration increases inequality because only the people who are rich enough to afford this investment, who are not credit constrained, can make the investment. So the remittances income go to relatively more richer and more affluent families. So within communities, you have a rise of inequality. But then over time, these richer migrants form networks who can benefit the people down in the income distribution, and then this has a kind of inequality reducing effect, and so it depends. So when people look at one context at one point in time, whatever conclusion they find would depend on which phase of the migration inequality relationship that community is. Now, my last point is a comment on Mirna. I'm also fascinated by this question of citizenship. I don't know if it's kind of the effect of having a prize or something that changes your behavior because you receive some distinction, let's say access to citizenship, or this is because of opportunities. I think it's an interesting question. I have a meeting at the Ministry of the Interior to try to work on naturalization data next week. Maybe you want to join me. And I want to convince them to give citizenship randomly for the sake of research. I know it will be a long shot, let's say, but maybe if we join forces, we have more chance. Thank you.
All right, let's give it. Well, hello everyone. My name is Stephen Manning. I'm a senior Tower scholar studying finance and math. And my question could really go to the entire panel, but I think Mirna would have a particularly interesting perspective. It has to do with the relationship between migration-induced ethnic diversity and kind of the welfare solidarity that we're seeing in higher income countries. And as we're coming out of the pandemic and entering an era of perhaps more economic nationalism than we had seen in the last 20 years, what steps do you think need to be taken to mitigate or prevent xenophobia from developing and preserve that welfare solidarity that makes a social safety net like we have in the United States and Western Europe more sustainable in a world with higher migration?
Well, that is such an enormous question. I think rather than taking more questions, I'd like to hear just a quick response from everybody on the panel about this. I don't know if this is the only microphone working, but I'll pass it around. So each of you want to try a quick response.
So you're asking a question that Milton Friedman famously asked, and he said, can we have mass immigration and a general welfare system? He was
told it is obvious that we cannot.
Yeah. He said we can't. So
which is crazy.
we like to tell he's wrong, but I'm not sure we can do that.
Yes, yeah, he believed it was obvious that strong social protection could be compatible with important immigration. Well, it has been completely countered by the last, for example, OECD report, because the OECD every year has updates the data about immigration, and they add also specific studies which change from one year to another. And in the last edition, you have an interesting assessment of the fiscal impact of immigration on social protection data across the OECD countries. And once again, because it's not the first time, but this time the study is much more elaborate than in the previous one. The conclusion is that no, there is a very, very few, very limited
fiscal impact of migration on the solidarity system, the social protection system, because the contribution of migrants to the fiscal system is as important as the benefits they take from the system. So this is one of the most fascinating example of the gap between the facts and the public discourse. But Mirna, you have
I think both. I mean, there are many questions, but the two main questions. So, is migration really? To what extent? The diversity is related to like decrease in social cohesion and welfare support. This is under study. Let's say I won't say a lot on this, but. Even the second part of your question, so to what extent migration is driving diversity, is also under research, I would say, and it's not so obvious. So a lot of studies on ethno-racial reconfigurations actually provide examples where migration can be actually, on the contrary, some kind of unmixing effects, or even lowering diversity, or at least changing the the ethno-racial classification. Just to give you a historical example that is well known and well studied, of course, how the Irish became white. Okay, and this idea that people actually, when they migrate, they introduce new materials, ethno-racial materials, and these materials are dynamics, and they can change the classifications that are at stake. In Europe, we can think about Eastern European migrations and the ways in which Eastern European migration will change actually also the ethno-racial classification. And another example maybe that is very telling is African migration to the US. African migration in the US is introducing actually a different correlation between skin color and socioeconomic resources, because African migrants tend to be actually highly educated. And so a lot of research is on really the extent to which this migration can change the significance of skin color if it's sustained. My point is that these things have to be understood in a dynamic way, and it's not so straightforward. Both questions are not so straightforward in terms of the answers.
It's just so I was at the 2-day conference, so I could listen to the different stories that you came with. So something which is I'm curious to have your views on this. So we talked about a lot about the transformative role of migration, and so you had this very nice contribution, providing convincing evidence that that migrants contribute to diffuse knowledge, to diffuse new ideas, and these go through a change that migration is producing on them, right? So they move to another country, so they are confronted with new ideas, new norms, and when they go back to their country, or through phone calls, etc., they contribute to change ideas in their country of origin. Something which I think we didn't talk about is whether there are some gender differences with regards to the transformative role of migration. I think there is. I mean, there was a very strong inequality with regards access to migration between women and men, right? For a long time, migration was mainly a male phenomenon, or I mean, you had. I mean, of course, maybe I'm talking a little bit about Africa than Asia, but in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of migration were either male migration or females moving with their husbands, for example. But now I think this has completely changed. You have a lot of autonomous migration with involving women, and I guess it is likely to make a real difference in terms of the diffusion of ideas and the change of norms, locally speaking. So I'd like to have your view on this, because this is something we didn't talk about at all during those 2 days. I had a very quick question, but it's maybe we'll talk together.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to thank Jim and Helen again for organizing this great conference and to the presenters for doing such a great job. So we've been here for a couple days and we've had an incredible diversity of approaches and ideas that have been presented. Just as we're kind of winding down now, I'd love to get this panel's opinion on what are the most important unanswered questions left on the table, or where should we go next, right, as a group of academics, and what are the most pressing questions that probably need to be answered? That's an easy one.
And I know Daniel will have a very pointed question.
Yeah, of course. Again, thanks also from me to all the presenters and the organizers. Amazing wealth of information. When we talk about inequality and migration, we know that, for example, in the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, 10.7 deals with migration governance, 10.c with remittances, which is in the goal on inequalities within and between countries. So we talked about the place premium and how much that actually may lead to less inequality by exchanging of welfare between countries for the individuals or the communities that benefit from that. But what we haven't talked about too much is about how limits in rights in the communities of destination can also perpetuate inequalities, right? The migrants who come here often have greater opportunities. We talked about the place premium and how the wage increases that they benefit as great, but because of limited rights, because of labor demand we talked about, that has an impact on, coupled with the restriction of rights, leading to irregular migrants, the community of labor demand plus restriction of rights, irregular migrants and other migrants who have the domestic workers you mentioned and that have very limited rights in terms of permanence, but of marriage or other important rights, which creates a very clear inequality between the migrant communities and the non-migrant communities, or sometimes between different migrant communities and other migrant communities. So how can we address these inequalities too and really come from a rights-based approach, but also from a development approach to really make it happen that those migrants can move up and then distribute those welfare gains better?
So let's go back to the panel now and take a round of answers to these questions, gender, research agendas, and Daniel's last question. So who would like to start on the panel here? Brenda? I think one of those microphones is working. That one's working. Okay.
Yeah, I can't resist the gender question because I think it's important that we add that to the discussion, and we really haven't said very much about it during the workshop. So I think, again, my answers are basically from the Asian context, because that's where I work, where there has been a feminization of migration, and in terms of the percentages, it's 48% of the migrants on the move are now women in Southeast Asia. So, and they of course moved to sort of a very gendered division of labor kind of jobs, in care work, in domestic work, entertainment work, and so forth. So, and what we are finding is that the demand for, because of the care deficits in global households in many places within Asia or elsewhere, has meant that there's stimulated sort of high demand for care workers, domestic workers, which are all female. So it's a very gender segmented market. So this leads to questions about the care chain. So one of the important issues that I've been working on is that as women move to the industrialized countries, economies in the north to fill the care deficits, what happens in the southernmost end of the global care chain? So what happens in the source countries? And there, I was hoping to have optimistic answers that as women move out of care work, this will be substituted by men taking on care roles. And I would say that it's again, this is not to vilify men or and so forth. What we found in several projects is that in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, is that the men do step up to fatherhood. They, in a sense, have to assume different masculine roles as responsible fathers now that they are their wives are the breadwinners, the primary breadwinners. So this idea that they're all drunks and sort of delinquents and all that, we didn't find that. So I'm not trying to rescue the men, but I'm just saying that the men do step up to care work. But it is not a revolution. It's not a sort of the women model, the women carer model still remains, because of course men do care work differently. They do that with a lot of help from other women, from the grandmothers, from the aunts and so forth. So many of the men will say, continue to hold on to some kind of paid work because that's part of their masculine identities. So, but they want to be seen to be, in a sense, contributing to the care work. So, so we see a different kind of caring work developing. So to me, the big question is this going to be gender transformative in the future? So because the demand for work, better paid work, is actually for women now in the Southeast Asian context. So
you at least partially answered Raymond's question there, that the migration is going to be transforming gender roles. Right. Who else would like to weigh in on these questions?
Well, about the question of rights, if you look at most of the European countries now, we could say that the majority of migrants do enter into these countries because they have the rights to. Because of family unification, asylum permits, well, to some extent, international students are part of this right system, because you have more or less de facto the right to make good studies in a good university abroad. And this is much up to the decision of the university than to the government. Well, it depends from the countries, of course. But in general, if you sum up the number of migrants whose admission is rights-based and not economic-based, it's much higher. Mm-hmm. This is the case in France. Now, of course, you have a huge diversity between the distribution of the categories of permits across Europe. It's very striking. For example, in Germany, 2/3 of the new annual permits are given to the other European people benefiting from the free circulation, which is a right to, and the free circulation of European subjects. 2/3 of the foreigners who are living, who are admitted in Germany are admitted because of free circulation. In France, it's only 1/3. There's a huge difference, and you have the same rule of law, the same international right, but the way each country is using it is very different. In the UK, it was also 2/3 before the Brexit, and the Brexit was, of course, directed against the importance of the European migration, etc. So, and it's not easy to understand why there are so huge differences between in the distribution of the categories of permits from one country to another in Europe. This is a legacy of a history to some part, the product of the internal law, etc. But well,
I don't know if any of the other panelists want to quickly weigh in on this question, or should we go back and take another quick round of questions?
I can say or if you
why don't we take one more quick round of questions, because we're going to run out of time. And Hélène, you want to weigh in?
Go ahead. If you have questions.
There's just it's working. Okay. Just to piggyback on Raymond's challenges, we need to find, the new questions and the new things that we want to talk about, things that we haven't addressed in 2 days. And I think we've already, with Pia and a lot of presenters, we've started to discuss how migration helps us understand in a more sophisticated way the relation between global inequalities and within countries inequalities, and and trying to bridge the gap between the individual level, both in economic terms or in anthropological terms, as Eliot used, or from various perspectives, and the more meso and macro level. For instance, the question of inequality and the perception of one's position or one's benefits within a society that, of course, changes when you move space and you move societies. So from low or middle or high income countries where you move, and your position within this society, which are things that relate to relative inequality, or I don't know if that's the term, to use it, and in a way moving away from seeing migration as a sort of macro equalizer under any condition, and trying to look at these various levels and various processes that are working between countries and within countries, and so it's not an answer, but paying attention to this, I think, is something that we've learned, across these 2 days. At least that's something that I keep.
I think all this is being recorded, so it will be something we can come back to. Yeah, don't turn it off; just hand it back to the panelists. But let's take one more very quick round of questions, and then we're going to go have a drink and eat something. So. I know Catherine wanted to get in. Malabika, no. Catherine, anyone else? Well, I think it would be very appropriate to give Catherine the last question of the day. Madame de Van Den.
Thanks. Perhaps we didn't speak a lot about migration control, which is the global context of migration policies, and the gap between the globalization of the right to move since the 1990s, mostly, and the restrictive policies to enter of immigration, and the differential status, whether you are going from south to south, south to north, north to north, and north to south. The status of migrants are very different according to these different parts of the world, and it has a very important impact on positive or negative effects of migration. Perhaps we didn't speak a lot about the negative aspects of migration, which is also a topic. Perhaps we cannot speak about that in the public opinion debate we have during these presidential elections. But for example, in some cases, in PhDs, in field study, we see that migration may reinforce, especially for those who are undocumented, the restrictive way of life in the family life without being inserted in the whole society where they are living, for example. Another impact can be if the migrants are going to very conservative countries, they may have more conservative demographic behaviors, for example. There are a lot of examples we could give about that. So I think we have to be careful about this beautiful approach we have had during these 2 days.
Anyone want to say something negative about migration before we stop here? Let's just quickly, Brenda wants to respond, but I think we take one last round of responses and then we're going to stop.
Yeah. Okay, so I can say something negative about migration. Actually, the one negative thing I should say is something that we wrote in a recent note we wrote with Emmanuel Auriol for the Council of Economic Advisors in France on immigration, and we reflected on France's failure in the vaccine race, and we said this is the fault of the immigrants, that France has no vaccine. The immigrants that we didn't take, the immigrants that we didn't promote. So look at all the the success stories there are in the vaccine and the startups and Moderna and Pfizer and Biogen. It's all about immigration, diversity, innovation, and so on. So that's the one thing negative I can say about migration, and that's it.
All right. I think it would be remiss of me in not to mention I think what I really, really want to, in a sense, add to the debate, that is that we do need to attend to the migration regime that we're talking about. Because much of the discourse so the norms, the discourses, and the policies vary according to the migration regime. And in the Asian case, where the temporary migration regime is dominant, there's no talk about rights. I mean, there's the whole model of migration and settlement, integration or assimilation, or is not something that's prevalent in the case of temporary labor migration. So in that case, migrants are welcome to labor, but they're not welcome to stay. There are no pathways to citizenship or settlement or residency and so forth. So in a sense, there's not even policies to do with integration. There are policies to do with non-integration, I mean non-citizenship. That is, I think, something that we do need to take into account because it varies according to the migration regime that's dominant. I'm not saying that that is so neatly divided that Asia is only temporary migration and Europe is migration and settlement. I mean, it varies, of course, but I think the dominant migration regime does influence the normative discourses that surround migration. So I think that's important. But I just want to add one last point, which is that I think a big question, back to what are the unanswered questions, does the pandemic shift our normative discourses about migration? And you might say that's very negative in the temporary migration regime, so the pandemic would worsen the discourse. But actually, there's silver lining as well, because with border controls being imposed and borders becoming tightened, remember that the temporary migration regime depends on churning migrants back and forth. So it only works. The triple win migration discourse is to do with churning migrants back and forth from sending to origin countries again and again based on contracts. But with the borders sort of shutting down and migrants being, in a sense, immobilized in either sending or origin countries, in destination countries which are highly dependent on labor migrants, and Singapore will be one, the value of temporary migrants have now become increased because there are shortages in the construction industry, there are shortages in the domestic work industry, and we're seeing migrants having a little bit more of bargaining power, even in terms of asking for higher salaries or small rights, like a day off and so forth. So I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to counter the negativity in the room, but just to say that maybe there's hope.
In the same line, some traits of the Singaporean migration policy looked like was the policy which obtained in the communist countries before the fall of the... Yes, if a woman was found pregnant in a Democratic Republic of Germany, for example, she had to get back or to abort. This was drastic, and there is now a lot of research in Germany about this, the way that this policy was, the revolving door policy, etc. At the end of the communist regime in GDR, it was a rather important migration. And of course, this is absolutely out of the rule of law. Right? It's contrary to the rule of law, because the right to marry everyone you want is is an article of the Universal Declaration of Rights, of Human Rights. And what happens in Europe in the 50s and the 60s, we had also more or less something like that. For example, the firms had this terrible practice that they dismissed the workers in the beginning of the summer, and they rehired the workers in fall, in September. And so people were not paid during the holidays. And it was thanks to the action of the diplomacy, especially of Italy, but also of Spain. And there was also an allusion to the fight by the trade unions of the recent countries. But the diplomatic action of Italy had played an important role in order to give to these guest workers and the temporary workers permanency and the right to create a family and to convert this family, this work immigration into a family migration and a settlement migration. I think this is the way that Singapore will have to follow anyway, in any way. For example, in the Gulf countries, you realize that now the average duration of the migrants is around 6 years, which begins to be a rather important stay. It's not just 1 year or 2 years. So the evolution is in this direction. And there is an important question is why countries such as India, for example, or Bangladesh do not have a strong diplomatic action in order to protect their citizens in the destination countries. This is an interesting topic for political scientists.
Yeah, very quickly, maybe just with regard border control, I think you're perfectly right. I think it's a very important topic to connect migration to inequality, at least through two general things, like the increase of border control during the last decades actually is a very impressive machine of categorization. So when you control, you need actually to create new categories, and this has been the story of the migration state in a lot of countries. And this actually distribute different rights across these categories, etc. So we have here a very direct mechanism of creation of categories of migration. And the second mechanism, which is also very impressive, is that actually today border control is the source of another inequality related to just survival. So we have more and more dangerous border crossing, and the research on how migration kills today is one of the most innovative ones.
Just a figure,
with regard to the questions about
20,000 deaths in the Mediterranean Sea since 2013. 20,000
deaths in the
of
Mediterranean,
migrants trying to
deaths on the border in the US, or the walls, fences, etc. So I'm going to stop here.